Have you ever noticed how some of the most powerful stories in the Bible are hidden in plain sight? Stories that could change everything we think we know about God's plan, about family, about justice, and about the price of silence. Today we're diving deep into one of the most overlooked yet profound narratives in all of Scripture. The story of Dinah, Jacob's only named daughter, whose life holds secrets that most believers have never discovered. This isn't just another Bible story you've heard 1,000 times. This is a narrative so complex, so layered with meaning, that scholars have debated its implications for centuries. It's a story that reveals uncomfortable truths about ancient society, about the treatment of women, and about the consequences of violence disguised as honor. But more than that, it's a story that speaks directly to our modern world in ways that might shock you. Here's what most people don't realize about Dinah's story. Her narrative isn't just a tragic footnote in the book of Genesis. It's actually one of the most theologically significant accounts in the entire Old Testament, with connections that stretch all the way to the lineage of Christ himself. The rabbis knew this. Ancient commentators understood this. But somehow, in our modern telling of biblical history, Dinah's voice has been silenced, her significance minimized, her story reduced to a cautionary tale. But what if I told you that Dinah's story holds keys to understanding God's heart for justice? What if her silence in the text actually speaks louder than words? What if the violence that followed her assault reveals something profound about how God views the violation of the innocent? And what if her ultimate fate connects to the very foundations of Israel's redemption? Drop a 777 in the comments if you're ready to uncover truths about Dinah that have been hidden for far too long. And make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because what we're about to explore will challenge everything you thought you knew about this forgotten daughter of Jacob. Let me paint you a picture of the world Dinah was born into. This wasn't a world of equality or women's rights. This was a harsh, patriarchal society where a woman's value was often measured by her usefulness to men, where silence was expected, and where violence was the language of honor. Into this world came a girl whose very name meant judgment, as if from the moment of her birth, the scales of justice were already being weighed. Dinah was born to Leah, the unloved wife of Jacob. Think about that for a moment. Her mother was trapped in a marriage where she was constantly competing for affection that would never truly be hers. Jacob's heart belonged to Rachel, Leah's younger sister, and everyone knew it. Can you imagine growing up in a household where your mother's pain was visible every single day? Where love was conditional, where favor was scarce, and where even the patriarch of your family had his heart divided? The rabbis tell us something fascinating about Dinah's conception. They say that Leah was actually pregnant with what would have been a seventh son, but through divine intervention, the child was transformed in the womb to become a daughter. Why? Because Leah understood that Jacob was destined to father 12 sons who would become the 12 tribes of Israel. If she had another son, that would leave only one son for her beloved sister Rachel to bear. So Leah prayed, and God changed her unborn son into a daughter. This detail isn't just interesting background information. It reveals something profound about the spiritual dynamics at work in Jacob's household. Even before Dinah drew her first breath, her existence was shaped by the complex web of rivalry, sacrifice, and divine purpose that defined her family. She was born as an act of mercy from one sister to another, a living testament to the complicated love that existed between Leah and Rachel. But here's where the story gets even more intriguing. Dinah's birth order places her in a unique position within the family structure. She was born after Leah's 6 sons, but before Rachel's first child, Joseph. This timing isn't coincidental. In ancient Near Eastern culture, birth order determined everything from inheritance rights to family responsibilities. Dinah occupied a space between the established sons of Leah and the favored sons who would come from Rachel. Think about what this meant for a young girl growing up in such a household. She had 6 older brothers who had already established their places in the family hierarchy. She watched as her father's attention was consistently drawn toward Rachel and away from her mother. And she knew that when Rachel finally bore children, those children would likely receive the kind of favor that she, as Leah's daughter, might never experience. The Bible gives us very little information about Dinah's childhood, but we can read between the lines. In a family of strong-willed brothers, where masculine strength and aggression were valued, where would a young woman find her place? The text tells us that when she was old enough, she went out to visit the daughters of the land. This wasn't a casual social call. This was a young woman seeking connection, seeking friendship, seeking a place where she could be understood. Some modern scholars suggest that Dinah's decision to venture out among the local women reveals something important about her character. She wasn't content to remain isolated within her father's household. She was curious about the world beyond her family's tents. She wanted to understand the customs and cultures of the people among whom they were living. In other words, Dinah had a mind of her own. But this curiosity, this desire for connection and understanding, would lead her directly into one of the most traumatic episodes recorded in the book of Genesis. Because the world outside her father's protection was not the safe haven she might have hoped for. It was a world where young women were seen as objects to be taken, where power determined right and wrong, and where a moment's vulnerability could shatter a life forever. The city of Shechem was bustling with activity when Dinah arrived to visit the local women. This wasn't some remote outpost, but a significant urban center with established customs, governing structures, and social hierarchies. Jacob had purchased land there, setting up what he intended to be a permanent settlement for his growing family. The decision to put down roots in Shechem seemed strategic and peaceful. Jacob was trying to build bridges with the local population to establish his household as respectable members of the community. But beneath the surface of this apparent harmony, tensions were brewing. Jacob's family were outsiders, foreigners with different customs and a different God. They were wealthy, which made them both valuable allies and potential targets. And they were few in number compared to the established population of Shechem, which made them vulnerable despite their wealth. Into this delicate political and social situation stepped Dinah, a young woman who represented not just herself but the honor of her entire family. In the ancient world, a daughter's conduct reflected directly on her father's reputation and her family's standing in the community. Every move she made, every relationship she formed, every decision she chose carried weight far beyond her individual life. The ruler of Shechem was a man named Hamor, and he had a son named Shechem, after whom the city was called. This young man was described as the most honored in all his father's house. He had power, influence, and the kind of authority that came from being born into the ruling class. He was accustomed to getting what he wanted, when he wanted it, without question or resistance. When Shechem saw Dinah among the women of his city, something stirred within him. The text tells us that he took her, lay with her, and humbled her. These words have been debated by scholars for centuries. Was this rape in the violent, aggressive sense that we understand today? Was it seduction? Was it a cultural practice that we can barely comprehend from our modern perspective? The Hebrew text leaves room for interpretation, and that ambiguity has shaped how Dinah's story has been told and retold through the ages. What we do know is that whatever happened between Shechem and Dinah fundamentally changed both of their lives. The text tells us that afterward, Shechem's soul clung to Dinah. He loved her. He spoke tenderly to her. This wasn't a case of a man taking his pleasure and walking away. This was something more complex, more emotionally charged, more personally invested. But here's what's crucial to understand about this moment. Regardless of Shechem's feelings, regardless of his intentions, regardless of what he might have felt was love or desire, Dinah had been rendered unclean according to the customs of her people. In the rigid social structure of the ancient Near East, a woman's virginity was not just personal purity, but family property. Once that was lost outside of marriage, she became unmarriageable within her own community. This is where Dinah's story becomes not just personal tragedy, but family crisis. When word reached Jacob that his daughter had been defiled, the implications went far beyond one young woman's fate. This was about honor, about reputation, about the family standing in a community where they were already outsiders. This was about power dynamics, about justice, about how a foreign family would respond to what they perceived as an attack on their most vulnerable member. The Bible tells us that Jacob heard what had happened and remained silent until his sons returned from the fields. Think about that silence for a moment. This is the same man who wrestled with God, who negotiated with Laban, who faced down his angry brother Esau. But when his daughter's honor was violated, when she was held captive in Shechem's house, when her future hung in the balance, Jacob said nothing. That silence speaks volumes about the world Dinah lived in. It reveals the complicated dynamics of a patriarchal society, where women's voices were often secondary to men's decisions. It shows us how even a beloved daughter could become a political chess piece in negotiations between men. And it foreshadows the violent response that would soon follow, a response that would echo through generations of Israel's history. When Jacob's sons heard what had happened to their sister, their reaction was immediate and intense. The text says they were grieved and very angry because Shechem had done a disgraceful thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter. For such a thing ought not to be done. Notice the language here. This wasn't just about Dinah as an individual. This was about an offense against Israel itself, against the emerging nation that Jacob's family represented. But what did Dinah herself think about all of this? What were her feelings as she remained in Shechem's house? Did she feel violated and trapped? Did she develop genuine feelings for the young man who claimed to love her? Did she hope for rescue or fear what her family's response might bring? The biblical text gives us no insight into Dinah's inner life during these crucial days. Her voice remains silent, her thoughts unrecorded, her agency seemingly removed from her own story. This silence has troubled readers for centuries. In a narrative where we hear the thoughts and feelings of so many biblical characters, where we're given insight into the motivations and emotions of patriarchs and matriarchs, kings and prophets, Dinah remains voiceless. She becomes the object of the story rather than its subject, the prize to be fought over rather than the person making choices about her own life. Meanwhile, Shechem and his father Hamor approached Jacob to negotiate for Dinah's hand in marriage. This wasn't an unusual request in the ancient world. When a man had relations with an unmarried woman, marriage was often the expected resolution. Shechem was even willing to pay whatever bride price Jacob demanded. He offered to make intermarriage agreements between their peoples. He proposed economic partnerships that could benefit both families. From a purely practical standpoint, this might have seemed like the best possible outcome of a difficult situation. Dinah would be married to a man who claimed to love her and who had the power and wealth to provide for her. The families would be united through marriage, creating stronger political and economic ties. The shame of what had happened could be transformed into an honorable alliance. But Jacob's sons had other plans, and their response would transform this personal tragedy into a story of revenge so brutal and far-reaching that it would shape the destiny of entire tribes and echo through the pages of biblical history for generations to come. The brothers' response to Hamor and Shechem's proposal was deceptively calm on the surface, but underneath burned a fury that would soon consume everything in its path. When the delegation from Shechem arrived at Jacob's camp, they came with every intention of making this right, according to their understanding of justice and honor. Hamor spoke eloquently about the benefits of intermarriage, about creating lasting bonds between their peoples, about turning this unfortunate situation into something that could benefit everyone involved. Shechem himself spoke with what appeared to be genuine emotion. He told Jacob and his sons that his soul longed for Dinah, that he would pay any price they named, that he would do whatever was necessary to make her his wife legitimately. In his mind, perhaps, he was offering the ultimate demonstration of his love and commitment. He wasn't trying to avoid responsibility for what had happened. He was embracing it, wanting to make it permanent and honorable. But Jacob's sons had already made their decision, and it wasn't about marriage or alliances or economic partnerships. It was about something much darker, much more final. They had decided that what happened to Dinah demanded not just justice, but total retribution. They had decided that Shechem and his people would pay not just for one man's actions, but for the entire system that had allowed those actions to occur. The brothers' response was carefully calculated. They told Hamor and Shechem that they could not give their sister to an uncircumcised man, for that would be a disgrace to them. But if all the men of Shechem would be circumcised, then they would give their daughters in marriage and take the local daughters for themselves. They would dwell together and become one people. On the surface, this seemed reasonable. Circumcision was the sign of the covenant that God had made with Abraham. It marked the boundary between those who belonged to Jacob's people and those who didn't. If the men of Shechem were willing to undergo this ritual, it would demonstrate their commitment to joining Jacob's family, not just through marriage but through religious conversion. Hamor and Shechem were delighted with this proposal. They saw it as a fair exchange, a way to resolve the crisis while gaining access to Jacob's wealth and establishing their people as part of a growing and prosperous clan. Shechem, eager to obtain Dinah as his wife, immediately agreed to undergo circumcision and persuaded all the men of his city to do the same. The text tells us that Shechem was the most honored among his father's household, and his influence was significant enough that he could convince an entire city of men to undergo a painful and potentially dangerous procedure, just so he could marry the woman he loved. Think about what this reveals about both his character and his desperation. This wasn't a casual desire. This was an all-consuming passion that drove him to extraordinary lengths. But what Shechem and his father didn't understand was that Jacob's sons had made this proposal in deceit. They had no intention of honoring their agreement. They were not planning to become one people with the inhabitants of Shechem. They were planning something far more sinister, something that would shock even their own father when he learned of it. The mass circumcision took place, and for 3 days the men of Shechem lay in agony as their bodies healed from the procedure. This was when they were most vulnerable, most defenseless, most unable to protect themselves or their families. And this was exactly what Jacob's sons had been waiting for. On the 3rd day, while the men were still in pain, 2 of Dinah's full brothers, Simeon and Levi, took their swords and entered the city boldly. They went from house to house, killing every male they found. These weren't warriors prepared for battle. These were men recovering from surgery, unable to fight back, unable to defend themselves or their loved ones. The slaughter was systematic, brutal, and complete. But Simeon and Levi didn't stop with just any men. They specifically sought out Hamor and Shechem, the father and son who had come to them in good faith, seeking a peaceful resolution. They killed them both and took Dinah from Shechem's house. After months of being held in what was essentially captivity, Dinah was finally free to return to her father's household, but at what cost? The other brothers, not content to let Simeon and Levi have all the revenge, came upon the slain and plundered the entire city. They took the flocks, the herds, the donkeys, everything in the city and in the fields. They captured all the women and children, making them slaves. They seized all the wealth, all the possessions, everything that had belonged to the people of Shechem. What had begun as one man's assault on one woman had escalated into the complete destruction of an entire community. Hundreds of innocent people paid with their lives for Shechem's actions. Children were orphaned, women were enslaved. An entire civilization was wiped out in a single day of vengeance disguised as justice. When Jacob learned what his sons had done, he was horrified. His immediate concern wasn't moral outrage, though that may have been part of it. His primary fear was practical and political. He told his sons that they had made him odious to the inhabitants of the land, that the Canaanites and Perizzites would unite against them, and that since Jacob's family was few in number, they would all be destroyed. Jacob understood that his sons' actions had made him and his entire household enemies of every surrounding community. Word would spread about what had happened in Shechem. Other cities would hear how Jacob's family had negotiated in bad faith, how they had used a sacred ritual as a weapon of war, how they had repaid hospitality with massacre. No one would trust them again. No one would make treaties with them. They had become pariahs in a land where they were already strangers. But Simeon and Levi were unrepentant. Their response to their father's rebuke was simple and direct. Should our sister be treated like a harlot? In their minds, they had done what honor demanded. They had avenged their sister's violation. They had sent a message to anyone who might consider harming a daughter of Jacob that such actions would have consequences beyond imagination. This response reveals something crucial about how these brothers understood justice. For them, this wasn't about proportional punishment or legal precedent. This was about absolute honor, about demonstrating that their family's women were not to be touched, that any violation would be met with total destruction. They were willing to risk everything, including their own lives and the lives of their entire family, to make this point. But what about Dinah herself? Throughout this entire bloody saga, from the initial assault through the negotiations to the final massacre, her voice remains absent from the narrative. We don't know what she thought about her brother's actions. We don't know if she wanted this level of vengeance carried out in her name. We don't know if she felt relieved to be rescued or horrified by the price of her freedom. The silence surrounding Dinah's perspective on these events is one of the most troubling aspects of her story. In a narrative that claims to be about defending her honor, about avenging her violation, about protecting her dignity, she herself is given no opportunity to speak. Her agency is removed not just by Shechem, who assaulted her, but by her own brothers who claimed to be acting on her behalf. This pattern of silencing women's voices in the name of protecting them is something that echoes through history and continues to resonate in our modern world. How often do we see women's stories told by others, their experiences interpreted through the lens of male understanding, their voices muted in favor of the men who claim to speak for them? Yet there's something else happening in this narrative that most readers miss. The extreme nature of the brothers' response suggests something deeper than simple revenge. Their willingness to risk everything, to potentially destroy their entire family's future, to commit genocide over one sister's assault, points to an understanding of justice that goes beyond human calculation. The ancient rabbis recognized this. They saw in Simeon and Levi's actions not just brotherly love, but divine zealousness. They understood that sometimes God's justice requires responses that seem disproportionate to human understanding. They connected this story to later events in Israel's history, when the tribe of Levi would again demonstrate absolute commitment to God's holiness, even when it meant taking extreme action against their own people. But the consequences of this zealousness would follow Simeon and Levi for the rest of their lives. Years later, when Jacob was on his deathbed giving his final blessings to his sons, he would remember what they had done in Shechem. His words would be harsh and prophetic. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. This curse would shape the destiny of their descendants for generations. The tribe of Simeon would eventually be absorbed into Judah, losing its independent identity. The tribe of Levi would be scattered throughout Israel, given no territorial inheritance, dependent on the other tribes for their survival. What seemed like victory in the moment would prove to be a burden that would last for centuries. The story of Dinah and the massacre at Shechem became a defining moment in the history of Jacob's family. It revealed the violence that lay beneath the surface of their relationships, the extremes to which they would go in the name of honor, the price they were willing to pay to protect what they considered sacred. But it also revealed the cost of such violence, the way that cycles of revenge can spiral beyond control, destroying not just enemies but entire communities, and leaving scars that last for generations. And through it all, Dinah herself remains a mystery. What happened to her after she was rescued from Shechem's house? Did she marry? Did she have children? Did she find peace or carry the trauma of these events for the rest of her life? The biblical text gives us no answers to these questions. Like so many women in ancient narratives, She disappears from the story once the men have finished using her experience to make their points about honor, justice, and revenge. But here's where the story takes a turn that most people never discover, where the silence of Scripture actually speaks louder than words, and where the rabbinical traditions begin to fill in gaps that will absolutely astound you. You see, the biblical text leaves Dinah's fate hanging in the air like an unfinished sentence. After the massacre at Shechem, after her brother's bloody revenge, after the political upheaval that followed, she simply vanishes from the narrative. It's as if the writers of Genesis decided that once the men had made their point about honor and justice, Dinah's actual life no longer mattered to the story they were telling. But the ancient rabbis couldn't let it rest there. They understood that every detail in Scripture carries weight, that every silence has meaning, that every gap in the narrative invites deeper exploration. And what they discovered about Dinah's ultimate fate will change everything you thought you knew about God's redemptive plan working through the most broken circumstances. According to ancient Jewish tradition, Dinah's story doesn't end with her rescue from Shechem's house. In fact, that rescue might have been just the beginning of an even more extraordinary chapter. The Midrash tells us that Dinah conceived a child from her encounter with Shechem, a daughter who would grow up to play a crucial role in the salvation history of Israel. Think about that for a moment. Out of violation came new life. Out of trauma came possibility. Out of what seemed like the end of Dinah's story came the beginning of something that would stretch across generations and ultimately connect to the very foundations of the 12 tribes of Israel. The child's name was Asenath, and according to rabbinical tradition, she would grow up to become the wife of Joseph, Dinah's own half-brother. This isn't just ancient storytelling filling in gaps for the sake of completeness. This is a profound theological statement about how God can weave redemption through the darkest threads of human experience. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. When Jacob's sons learned that Dinah had given birth to a child conceived through her assault, they wanted to kill the infant. In their minds, this baby represented shame, a permanent reminder of their sister's violation and their family's dishonor. They couldn't bear the thought that it would be said there was harlotry in Jacob's tents. Jacob, however, had a different response. Instead of allowing his sons to commit another act of violence, instead of covering up this inconvenient reminder of their family's trauma, he chose a path that would preserve the child's life while protecting the family's reputation. He took a golden plate and inscribed upon it either the name of God or the story of what had happened with Shechem, depending on which tradition you follow. Then Jacob did something that must have broken his heart. He hung this plate around the baby's neck and sent her away. Not to die, but to live. Not to be forgotten, but to be preserved for a purpose that he couldn't yet understand. According to the Midrash, God dispatched the angel Michael to carry this infant to safety, bringing her to the house of Potiphar in Egypt. Can you imagine the faith it took for Jacob to make that decision? Here was his granddaughter, born from circumstances that brought shame and pain to his family. And instead of destroying her or hiding her away, he chose to trust that God might have a plan even for this most difficult situation. He chose to believe that redemption could come from the most unlikely places. Potiphar found the crying infant by the wall of his estate and saw the golden plate around her neck. When he read what was inscribed there, he understood that this was no ordinary abandoned child. "This girl is the daughter of great ones," he told his servants. And so Asenath was raised in the household of one of Egypt's most powerful officials, prepared for a destiny she couldn't have imagined. Years later, when Joseph rose to become second in command over all of Egypt, when he was at the height of his power and influence, he encountered this young woman who had been raised in Potiphar's house. The tradition tells us that Joseph was immediately impressed not just by her beauty, but by her commitment to faith, by her spiritual depth, by her ability to maintain her beliefs even in the midst of Egyptian paganism. When Joseph learned Asenath's true identity, when he discovered that she was actually his niece, the daughter of his sister Dinah, born from that traumatic encounter in Shechem, he saw in her story something that resonated with his own experience of redemption. Here was someone else who had been rejected by family, who had been sent away from home, who had found themselves in Egypt through circumstances beyond their control. Joseph married Asenath, and together they had 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. These boys, born in Egypt to parents who had both experienced profound displacement and trauma, would grow up to become 2 of the most spiritually significant figures in Israel's history. Despite being raised in luxury in a foreign land, despite being separated from the covenant community, they remained so spiritually centered that they surpassed even their cousins who were raised in Canaan. When Jacob finally came to Egypt and met his great-grandsons for the first time, he was so impressed by their character and faith that he chose to adopt them as his own sons, giving them equal inheritance with his other children. Manasseh and Ephraim became 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel, their names called out alongside those of Jacob's biological sons when the inheritance was distributed. But here's the stunning truth that most people miss. This means that 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel trace their lineage back to Dinah, the woman whose voice was silenced, whose story was marginalized, whose experience was used by others to make points about honor and revenge, became the grandmother of 2 of the most significant tribes in Israel's history. The tribe of Ephraim would produce Joshua, the man who would lead Israel into the promised land. The tribe of Manasseh would control vast territories on both sides of the Jordan River, becoming one of the most powerful and influential groups in ancient Israel. Through Dinah's lineage, through the child born from her trauma, came leadership and inheritance and blessing that would shape the destiny of God's people for generations. This isn't just a beautiful story of redemption, though it certainly is that. This is a profound theological statement about how God works through human brokenness to accomplish His purposes. It's a declaration that no experience is too traumatic, no situation too shameful, no voice too silenced for God to use in His redemptive plan. But there's another tradition about Dinah that's equally fascinating and reveals yet another layer of God's restorative justice. Some rabbinical sources suggest that Dinah herself eventually found love and marriage within her own family. According to this tradition, her brother Simeon, the same Simeon who had avenged her violation with such fierce violence, promised to marry her himself when no one else would consider her suitable for marriage after what had happened. The biblical text mentions among Simeon's sons Saul, the son of the Canaanite woman. According to tradition, this Canaanite woman was actually Dinah, called by that name because she had been violated by a Canaanite. Simeon kept his promise to his sister, marrying her and giving her the security and honor that her assault had seemingly taken away. Think about the profound statement this makes about restorative justice. Simeon's violent response to his sister's violation was condemned by their father and would be cursed by God. But his personal response to his sister's need for acceptance and security was one of sacrificial love. He was willing to take as his wife a woman that society considered unmarriageable, to give her children and status and belonging within the covenant community. Yet another tradition connects Dinah to one of the most famous figures in biblical literature, Job. According to this account, after Asenath was sent to Egypt and after Dinah's marriage to Simeon, she eventually became the wife of the man whose patience and faithfulness would become legendary throughout the ancient world. This would mean that the woman who experienced such profound suffering and injustice became the companion of the man whose story became the ultimate exploration of why the righteous suffer. Whether or not you accept these rabbinical traditions as historically accurate, they reveal something crucial about how ancient interpreters understood Dinah's significance. They couldn't accept that her story ended with silence and marginalization. They insisted on finding ways to connect her experience to the larger narrative of God's redemptive work in the world. They refused to let her remain voiceless. These traditions also reveal something important about how trauma and redemption can coexist in the same story. Dinah's violation didn't disqualify her from being used by God. Her silence in the biblical text didn't mean her voice was permanently lost. The shame that others tried to attach to her experience didn't prevent her from becoming an ancestor of tribes and leaders, and ultimately of the Messiah himself. But perhaps most importantly, these traditions challenge us to reconsider how we read the silences in Scripture. When women's voices are absent from biblical narratives, when their perspectives are not recorded, when their experiences are filtered through male interpretation, that doesn't mean those voices don't matter. It might mean we need to listen more carefully, to dig deeper, to refuse to accept that marginalization is the end of the story. The ancient rabbis understood something that we often miss in our modern readings of Scripture. They knew that every detail matters, that every silence carries meaning, that every gap in the narrative is an invitation to discover deeper truths. They refused to let Dinah disappear from the story without tracing the threads of her influence through the generations that followed. And what they discovered was that the woman whose voice was silenced became the ancestral mother of voices that would echo through Israel's history. The woman whose agency was removed became the grandmother of men who would lead with unprecedented authority. The woman whose story was told by others became the foundation for stories that would inspire faith for thousands of years. This is how God works. This is how redemption functions in the real world. Not by erasing trauma or pretending violation never happened, but by weaving even the most painful experiences into a tapestry of purpose and meaning that stretches far beyond what we can see in the moment. Dinah's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about violence, about justice, about the silencing of women's voices, about the ways that families can both protect and harm their most vulnerable members. But it also invites us to see how God can take the worst that humans can do to each other and somehow, mysteriously, work through it to accomplish purposes that serve his ultimate plan of redemption. The secret role of Dinah wasn't just as a victim whose assault sparked a cycle of violence. It wasn't just as a silent figure whose experience was used by others to make points about honor and revenge. Her secret role was as a link in the chain of redemption, as an ancestor whose lineage would produce leaders and tribes and ultimately contribute to the coming of the Messiah himself. Through her trauma came new life. Through her silence came voices that would speak for generations. Through her marginalization came influence that would shape the destiny of nations. This is the hidden truth about Dinah that most believers have never discovered. The secret that transforms her from a forgotten footnote into a crucial figure in God's unfolding plan of salvation. Her story reminds us that God sees every injustice, hears every cry that goes unrecorded, and remembers every voice that others choose to silence. In a world where women's experiences were often dismissed or overlooked, where their pain was secondary to men's honor, where their futures were determined by others' decisions, Dinah's ultimate vindication came not through human justice, but through divine purpose. And this brings us to perhaps the most profound lesson hidden within Dinah's narrative. Her story isn't just about ancient history or rabbinical traditions or genealogical connections. It's about how God specializes in writing beautiful endings to stories that seem destined for tragedy. It's about how the most broken chapters of our lives can become the foundation for the most powerful testimonies of redemption. Think about every person you know who carries shame from something that was done to them rather than something they chose to do. Think about every woman whose voice has been silenced, whose experience has been minimized, whose pain has been used by others to make points about honor or justice or family reputation. Dinah's story speaks directly to those experiences with a message that echoes across millennia. Your silence doesn't mean your story is over. Your trauma doesn't disqualify you from being used by God. The worst thing that ever happened to you doesn't have to define the rest of your life. Sometimes the very experiences that others use to marginalize you become the foundation for influence you never imagined possible. The rabbis understood something we often forget in our rush to find simple moral lessons in biblical narratives. They knew that God's ways are not our ways, that his thoughts are higher than our thoughts, that his ability to bring good from evil stretches far beyond our human understanding of justice and fairness. Dinah's story challenges every assumption we make about how God works in the world. It refuses to fit into neat categories of victim and victor, of punishment and reward, of shame and honor. Instead, it presents us with a complex tapestry where threads of pain and purpose are woven together, so tightly that you cannot remove one without destroying the beauty of the whole. This is why her story has been preserved in Scripture, not as a cautionary tale or a simple narrative about ancient customs, but as a testimony to the mysterious ways that God accomplishes His purposes through human brokenness. This is why the ancient interpreters couldn't let her story end with silence and marginalization. They understood that in God's economy, nothing is wasted, no pain is meaningless, no voice is permanently lost. But here's what might be the most important truth about Dinah's secret role in redemption history. Her story points us forward to another woman whose experience would echo many of the same themes. Centuries later, another young woman would find herself pregnant under circumstances that brought shame and confusion to her family. Another woman would face questions about her purity, her honor, her fitness to be part of God's covenant community. But this time, instead of silence and marginalization, there would be angelic announcements and prophetic proclamations. Instead of brothers seeking violent revenge, there would be a husband who chose to protect and provide. Instead of a story told by others, there would be a woman whose voice would ring out in one of the most beautiful songs of praise ever recorded. Mary's story doesn't erase Dinah's story. Instead, it completes it. It shows us how God was working, even in the darkest chapters of Israel's history, to prepare the way for the ultimate redemption that would come through the seed of the woman. Dinah's silence paved the way for Mary's song. Dinah's marginalization highlighted the revolutionary nature of Mary's elevation. Dinah's voicelessness made Mary's voice all the more powerful. And both women, separated by centuries but connected by purpose, remind us that God's redemptive plan often works through the very people that society overlooks, dismisses, or silences. The women whose stories are told by others often become the mothers of the stories that change everything. This is the secret role of Dinah that has been hidden in plain sight for thousands of years. Not just as a victim whose assault sparked violence, not just as a silent figure whose experience was used by others, but as a crucial link in the chain of redemption that stretches from the Garden of Eden to the cross of Calvary and beyond. Her story teaches us to look for God's purposes in our pain, to listen for His voice in our silence, to trust His redemption even when we cannot see how our broken pieces could ever be made into something beautiful. It reminds us that the God who brought tribes and leaders and ultimately the Messiah Himself from Dinah's trauma is still working today to bring hope from our hardest experiences. So the next time you encounter someone whose voice has been silenced, whose story has been marginalized, whose pain has been used by others to make points about honor or justice or family reputation, remember Dinah. Remember that God sees what others overlook, hears what others dismiss, and has purposes that stretch far beyond our human understanding of how stories should end. The secret role of Jacob's forgotten daughter was never really forgotten at all. It was simply hidden, waiting for those who would dig deeper, listen more carefully, and refuse to accept that marginalization is ever the end of the story. In God's hands, even our silences can speak, even our shame can become strength, and even our most painful chapters can become the foundation for testimonies that echo through eternity. That's the power of redemption. That's the mystery of grace. And that's the secret that Dinah's story has been whispering to anyone willing to listen for over 3,000 years. If this opened your eyes to truths you've never considered before, make sure to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear that their story isn't over. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we're committed to uncovering the hidden treasures in God's Word that can transform how you see His heart for the broken, the silenced, and the forgotten. And remember, in God's economy, nothing is wasted. Every tear has purpose, every silence carries meaning, and every story, no matter how broken it seems, can become part of the greatest story ever told. The story of redemption that began in a garden was written in blood on a cross, and continues today in the lives of everyone who refuses to believe that their pain has the final word. God bless you, and may you discover your own secret role in His unfolding plan of redemption.